So what I've been trying to do, not just in the book, but in my work more broadly, is to think about how civil society activists and social movements become involved in shaping how we remember the past. So not only for Germany, but in other contexts as well, including in Canada, scholars have really mainly focused on how states and elites like intellectuals and politicians and historians get involved in how our societies think about the past. And so what I've been trying to do is to think about how do grassroots movements and activists get involved in those processes. And actually that's, in a way, it's a common sense kind of focus, right? Because if you look at what's been happening around the world, especially this year and last year, with protests brought on by the murder by the police of George Floyd and other events like this, Black Lives Matter has gotten involved in trying to shape how we view racist and colonial pasts in Canada and North America and elsewhere. So this is actually something that probably makes sense to a lot of people, but strangely, researchers haven't really looked at this very much. So what I tried to do in this book was to really examine how, for example, survivors of the Holocaust, but also citizens' initiatives, for example, tried to get German society to be more cognizant of their recent past. So as most people will probably know, post-war German society wasn't exactly keen on really tackling their own responsibility for the Holocaust and for World War II. And so, some people have said, well, Germans really wanted to forget the past, but actually that's really not true, because there was a lot of activity to remember the past, but not in a critical way. So in the immediate post-war period, Germans were very active in remembering their history, but not so much the Holocaust, more, for example, the experience of bombing campaigns of German cities, the fact that many ethnic Germans had fled from Eastern Europe, and also the experience of veterans in the war. So all of these things were very actively remembered and memorialized. We have thousands of memorials in Germany, in West Germany especially, that remember, for example, the Eastern territories or the bombings. And these were mostly built by civil society organizations with the support of the state in many instances. And at the same time, Germans weren't talking very much about the Holocaust, but nevertheless, survivor organizations immediately became active in trying to remember their own loved ones and the people that had experienced the Holocaust with them. And so there was a really strong effort to remember these things, but they didn't receive a lot of support from the state and from mainstream society. But we do have a lot of instances where, for example, at sites of former concentration camps, you find memorials, and they were mostly built by survivors themselves. So you have a lot of activity, but this is not really something that's recognized today as really important in how the past was shaped in post-war Germany. Now, what I look at in the book is that even though these, early efforts to remember the Holocaust weren't exactly broadly seen or really taken on by German society, they were something that could be built on later on, in the 70s and 80s, particularly when German society experienced a change, partly through the student movement, but also through intellectual work. And there was now a growing interest, partly, of course, also because of the generational change, right? You no longer have people in power who were really responsible during and for the Holocaust. So we now see citizens' initiatives, especially on the left, you have to say. It is very much a partisan issue, where people start investigating not so much, what can we do to remember the Holocaust in Germany as a whole, but more what happened in my city, even in my street, right? Who was responsible? Where did the Jewish neighbors live, and where were they deported from? So there was what was called a history workshop movement, right? Sort of a grassroots movement where people started to investigate in many different places in West Germany what actually happened. So it was less ideological kind of work where people were really trying to understand how was this possible. And this really led to a very broad interest in the Holocaust and influenced, for example, how this topic is taught in schools, and how also the state later started to commemorate in much more official ways this history. Now, I have to say that, of course, this happened mostly in West Germany, because in East Germany, we have a very different situation, because from the beginning, after the Second World War, the East German state took this idea of responsibility for the past very much in an official way, and used it as part of its state ideology. So even though the East German state did commemorate the Holocaust, it did it in a very particular way, and also not in a way that really promoted, a deep thinking about individual responsibility and so forth. Yeah, so there's a different situation in East and West, and then we have unification, where we now have the complicated situation of German society having to deal both with the Holocaust and with the communist past and the repression that happened under the communist regime, and in a way a third past, which is how did the communist regime deal with the Holocaust and the Nazi past, right? So it's a very complicated situation, and so this difficulty of remembering various pasts is actually very strongly influenced in the 1990s and 2000s, also by civil society organizations. I would say that part of the explanation for why the right in Germany currently has been quite successful with its memory politics, because they very strategically employ memory for their purposes, is really big, or let me put it this way, the reason they've been successful can be explained by the civil society grounding of Germany's memory culture. So what I described before, that there was this grassroots movement to commemorate the Nazi past and the Holocaust in particular. It was a grassroots movement because the state at that point wasn't really willing to do that work, and so the grassroots movement began as an anti-state, anti-government movement, right? Very much with an identity of we are challenging the state's narrative, because at the time in the 1980s, the conservative government under Kohl, they weren't denying the Holocaust, of course, and that was very much part of their foreign policy. But they also had a narrative about, well, let's normalize the German past, and let's, also remember the good periods of German history and so forth, right? So, for example, building the German Historical Museum, which was, the groundwork was laid in 1987, was part of that project in a way to sort of say, okay, we're a normal country. Now that really was challenged by this grassroots movement, and in the aftermath of the 1990 unification, we have two things happening. One is that you have these big memorial institutions in East Germany that had been used and instrumentalized really by the East German state. They had these big memorials, and you had to do something about them after democratization and unification. And so there was a lot of money provided by the state, the unified state, for these memorials. And so they were very much professionalized and modernized. And at the same time, you have what you might call a march into the institutions of the civil society activists, who many of them got jobs in these memorials and brought, their principles and their beliefs into the institutions of the state. So this idea of, an honest, a critical confrontation with the past moved from being in the realm of social movements and civil society into the realm of the state. It became state policy, essentially. And it is very much raison d'etre for the German state now, right? It is something that German foreign policy is grounded upon, including, support for the state of Israel and so forth. So this is part of the German state's mainstream narrative now. There's something that is supported through education, through, like I said, foreign policy, in large memorials. There's lots of funding for this. And so it's now gotten this kind of, maybe a little bit of a strange aftertaste for some people, because it seems like the official narrative that is not very open anymore to challenge from below. So to give you an example, a lot of victims of the communist regime feel like that their past is not privileged in German society. So there's always a bit of a competition between remembering the Holocaust, the Nazi past, and the communist dictatorship. Even though most representatives of the victims of communism very clearly say that they do not want to, compare the two directly, and that they don't want to relativize the Holocaust and so forth. But there's always that kind of suspicion. And the AfD has used this discomfort in a very smart way, to kind of put themselves forward as the representatives in a way of the people who do want to remember the GDR past and the communist repression, and generally say that the life experiences of certain members of society haven't been valued enough, and that we are overvaluing in Germany the story about the Nazi past. So that's obviously a very simplistic way of putting it, but you can see on the ground that the AfD, strategically kind of courts those representatives of memory culture that are interested in commemorating East German repression. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the mobilization around Germany's colonial past, in a way, is very similar to what was happening in the 1980s, to challenge the state to open up and think about the Nazi past. But as we saw in the 1980s, the elites in Germany are not very open to this, right? So there really is a need for this civic challenge. But the interesting thing is that some of the elites come from the civil society sector, as I've mentioned, right? So there's a very, in a way, it's a very classic development for a movement, right? You challenge, then you're successful, you become part of the power elite, and then you don't want other people to challenge you, right? So it's maybe also a generational issue, right? In the 1980s, these people were in their 20s and 30s, and now they're in leadership positions and close to retirement. So it's a very interesting, in a way, personal dynamic. But yeah, politically, I think that Germany is really just at the beginning of discussing its colonial past, and this sort of insistence that the Holocaust must be the primary narrative for German memory culture is very obstructive to raising other issues like colonialism, like, how does migration, or how has migration influenced German society? There's sort of an almost automatic suspicion directed at people who want to have other conversations, even when they very clearly say that, they're not questioning the importance of the Holocaust for German memory culture and for democracy, because I think, that's very clear that this discussion around the Holocaust has really had the effect of deeply democratizing German society. So that was absolutely important. And so it's good to understand why people are so attached to it, because it did have that very important role. I do think that the discussion in Canada, as fraught as it still is much further along than in Germany. There is much more recognition of the importance of these discussions. When you think about how events are organized, even, or that you have land acknowledgements as a routine matter in Canada, that sort of thing just doesn't exist yet in Germany. And it is very, like I said, it's very much at the beginning. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about memory, right, is that it is in some ways always local because, when we think about events or people, they're pretty much always linked to particular places. So their commemoration is almost by definition local. And so there has been a focus in scholarship on local and, well, really on national commemoration. But because our societies are becoming more transnationalized and our social relations, our networks are becoming more transnational, is our commemoration. And so I think it's quite interesting to look at, for example, in the field that I'm interested in memory activism, we see, of course, a lot of movement across borders by the activists themselves, but also by the memory frames that they use, the kind of language that they use, or the practices that they use to commemorate. So all of this is relatively mobile and moves and influences across borders, across national borders, but also other borders. And sometimes other borders are established through those relationships, right? So it's not always the national borders that are the crucial ones in this work. And so I've, for example, just finished editing a handbook on memory activism, where you see a lot of examples of activists taking inspiration from memory work in other places, of working together, of building solidarity across borders. And this is, by the way, not a topic or not an issue that affects only the kinds of memory work that we tend to like, that is pro-democracy and pro-inclusion and anti-racist and all of these things. We can see that populist movements, racist movements are very, very good at collaborating across borders. And so it's also something that I think as democratic actors, as people who want to work for democracy, is something we need to be aware of, because we need to be able to counter these, and that goes both for grassroots actors and academics, but also for states. I think it's something that policymakers need to think about as they think about their own memory cultures, is that it cannot really just be located within their borders.